The screaming descent of 1,000 Allied bombers shattered the winter silence over Berlin on the morning of February 3, 1945. Generalmajor Adolf Galland pressed his face against the frost-covered window of his command bunker, watching helplessly as wave after wave of American flying fortresses and British Lancasters darkened the sky like a plague of locusts. The rumble of their engines drowned out even the thunderous explosions that rippled across the Reich's capital, each detonation a death knell for the fatherland he had sworn to defend from the air. Galland's weathered hands trembled not from the cold seeping through the concrete walls, but from the crushing weight of inevitable defeat. The man who had once been the youngest general in the Luftwaffe, who had shot down 104 Allied aircraft in aerial combat, now commanded fewer than 800 operational fighters across all of Germany. Against him flew more than 13,000 Allied aircraft, their silver wings glinting like sword blades in the pale winter sun. The irony was not lost on him. 4 years earlier, the Luftwaffe had terrorized London during the Blitz, raining death from above, while Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring boasted that no enemy bomber would ever penetrate German airspace. Now, in the final winter of the war, Allied air armadas struck German cities with impunity, their formations so vast they blotted out the sun. The hunters had become the hunted, and the once mighty Luftwaffe was bleeding to death in the frozen skies above the crumbling Reich. Below, in the bunker's operations room, tired-eyed officers moved colored pins across enormous maps with the mechanical precision of undertakers arranging funeral flowers. Each pin represented a squadron, a wing, a group, most of them existing now only on paper. The Luftwaffe's order of battle had become a fantasy, maintained by staff officers who dared not tell their superiors the truth. Germany had lost the air war months ago, and with it, any hope of avoiding total defeat. Oberstleutnant Johann Steinhoff, one of Galland's most trusted pilots, entered the bunker with mud caked on his flying boots and exhaustion etched into his face. He had just returned from a morning sortie over the Western Front, where his small formation of Messerschmitt Bf. 109 fighters had attempted to intercept American bombers heading for Munich. Of the 12 aircraft that had taken off at dawn, only 5 had returned. The others had been torn apart by the escorting Mustangs and Thunderbolts that now accompanied every Allied bombing mission in overwhelming numbers. "Herr General," Steinhoff reported, his voice hollow with defeat, "we managed to down 3 bombers, but lost 7 of our own. The Americans had at least 60 fighters protecting their formation. We were outnumbered 12 to 1. He paused, struggling with words that felt like shards of glass in his throat. "At this rate, we will have no operational aircraft left within a month." Galland nodded grimly, unsurprised by the report. Similar messages had been arriving from airfields across Germany for weeks. The mathematics of aerial warfare had turned irrevocably against them. Every sortie cost them irreplaceable pilots and aircraft they could not replace, while the Allies seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply of both. The Reich's aviation industry, once the envy of the world, now lay in ruins beneath the rubble of bombed factories. Skilled pilots, trained over years of combat, were dying faster than green recruits could be rushed through abbreviated flight training. Outside, the bombing continued with methodical precision. Each explosion sent tremors through the bunker walls, a rhythmic drumbeat announcing the death of the Third Reich from the air. The collapse of German air power had not happened overnight, but rather through a series of catastrophic defeats that stripped the Luftwaffe of its ability to contest Allied dominance of European skies. By January 1945, the situation had become so desperate that even the most optimistic Nazi officials privately acknowledged that Germany's air force existed in name only. General Oberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, commanding the Reich Air Fleet, studied the latest intelligence reports with growing despair. Allied production figures painted a picture of industrial might that bordered on the incomprehensible. American factories were now producing aircraft at a rate of 96,000 per year, while British production added another 26,000. In contrast, German aircraft production had fallen to fewer than 35,000 annually, and most of those were being destroyed on the ground before they could become operational. The fuel crisis had become equally crippling. Romanian oil fields, once the lifeblood of the German war machine, had fallen to Soviet forces in August 1944. Synthetic fuel plants across the Reich had been systematically targeted and destroyed by Allied bombing campaigns, reducing aviation fuel supplies to a trickle. Many Luftwaffe squadrons now had aircraft but no fuel to fly them, creating the surreal spectacle of modern fighters serving as elaborate scarecrows on abandoned airfields. At Jagdgeschwader 26's base near Munster, Hauptmann Franz Stigler watched his mechanics push a pristine Focke-Wulf 190 fighter into a camouflaged hangar. The aircraft had enough fuel for perhaps 30 minutes of flight time, barely enough to reach the front lines, let alone engage in sustained combat. His squadron, once 36 aircraft strong, could now field only 8 operational fighters. On its best days, the Americans fly 3 sorties per day, Stigler confided to his wingman, Lieutenant Klaus Muller, as they observed another massive Allied formation passing overhead unchallenged. Their pilots complete their 25 mission tours and go home to train new aircrews. Meanwhile, we fly until we die, because there is no one to replace us. The stark mathematics of attrition had tilted irrevocably in favor of the Allies. German pilot training programs, once the finest in the world, had been shortened from 2 years to 6 months, as the Reich desperately tried to replace its losses. These hastily trained pilots, many with fewer than 100 hours of flight time, were being fed into combat against Allied veterans who possessed not only superior numbers, but also years of operational experience. Major Heinz Bauer, one of Germany's most successful fighter pilots with 220 confirmed victories, had witnessed the transformation firsthand. "We are sending children to fight men," he wrote in his diary after watching a formation of novice pilots take off for what would be their final mission. "They have courage but lack the skill to survive even their first encounter with enemy fighters." The Allied air forces, meanwhile, had evolved into a sophisticated war machine capable of sustained operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. The United States Army Air Forces alone could field more than 79,000 aircraft worldwide, supported by a training system that produced 43,000 new pilots annually. British Royal Air Force squadrons, battle-hardened by years of combat, had perfected the art of strategic bombing with scientific precision. Reichsmarschall Göring, the man responsible for the Luftwaffe's decline, had become increasingly detached from reality as the situation deteriorated. His morphine addiction and grandiose proclamations provided little comfort to the fighter pilots dying in unequal combat over German cities. Göring promises us wonder weapons that exist only in his imagination, Galland confided to his staff officers, while Allied bombers turn our cities to ash with impunity. The wonder weapons themselves, jet-powered Messerschmitt Me-262, fighters and rocket-powered Messerschmitt Me-163. Interceptors arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome. Even these technological marvels could not overcome the fundamental reality of German industrial collapse and pilot shortage. On New Year's Day, 1945, the Luftwaffe attempted one final, desperate gamble to regain some measure of air superiority over Western Europe. Operation Bodenplatte, conceived in the fevered imagination of desperate generals, would throw nearly every remaining German fighter against Allied airfields in Belgium, Holland, and northern France. It was to be a coordinated surprise attack, designed to cripple Allied tactical air power supporting the ground offensive in the Ardennes. Oberst Dietrich Roebuck, leading Jagdgeschwader 52, received his operational orders with mixed emotions. The plan called for more than 800 German fighters to strike 17 Allied airfields simultaneously at dawn, catching enemy aircraft on the ground where they would be most vulnerable. On paper, the operation appeared bold and potentially decisive. In reality, it represented the Luftwaffe's final suicide mission. The irony was immediately apparent to experienced pilots like Rabach. To marshal 800 operational fighters, the Luftwaffe had stripped every defensive unit from across Germany, leaving the Reich cities and industrial centers completely exposed to Allied bombing. Moreover, many of the pilots assigned to the mission had never flown in large formations and possessed minimal navigation experience. They would be flying at extremely low altitude over unfamiliar territory, in radio silence, hoping to avoid both Allied fighters and their own anti-aircraft. Defenses.Hauptmann Johannes Naumann, commanding a squadron of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters based near Frankfurt, spent the final hours before takeoff briefing his pilots on target recognition and escape routes. Most of his airmen were barely 20 years old, with fewer than 50 hours of combat experience. They would be flying against seasoned Allied squadrons operating from well-defended bases equipped with radar warning systems and rapid response fighter patrols. Remember, Naumann told his young pilots, surprise is our only advantage. Once we lose that, we must rely on speed and prayer to survive. He did not mention that German intelligence about Allied airfield locations was weeks out of date, or that many of the targeted bases had been relocated or heavily reinforced since the original planning began. At 0520 hours on January 1st, the largest German air operation since the Battle of Britain began with nearly simultaneous takeoffs from airfields across occupied Europe. The sight was both magnificent and tragic. Hundreds of German fighters rising into the pale winter dawn like a flock of doomed eagles, their engines roaring defiance against the inevitable. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. German fighters swept across Allied airfields, strafing parked aircraft and ground installations with devastating effect. At Eindhoven Air Base in Holland, Jagdgeschwader 3 destroyed 46 Allied aircraft on the ground. Similar scenes played out across the target area as German pilots pressed home their attacks with suicidal determination. However, the operation's initial success quickly transformed into catastrophe. Many German formations became lost in the winter haze, unable to locate their assigned targets. Others were decimated by Allied anti-aircraft fire, which had been expecting such an attack for weeks. Most critically, the Luftwaffe's own flak units, not informed of the operation for security reasons, shot down dozens of returning German aircraft, mistaking them for Allied intruders. Major Gerhard Barker, Germany's second highest scoring fighter, Ace, watched helplessly as his formation was torn apart by friendly fire over their own airfield. "We are shooting down our own pilots," he radioed frantically to ground control. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" But the anti-aircraft gunners, conditioned by months of Allied air attacks, continued firing at anything that moved in the sky. By days end, Operation Bodenplatte had cost the Luftwaffe 300 aircraft and pilots, nearly 40% of its remaining strength. While Allied losses were significant, totaling 150 aircraft destroyed on the ground, they were replaced within days by the inexhaustible Allied production machine. This context is taken from The Rise and Fall of the German Air Force by K.J. Becker. The Luftwaffe's losses, by contrast, were irreplaceable, leaving Germany's airspace virtually defenseless for the final months of the war. Following the disastrous failure of Operation Bodenplatte, German air defenses crumbled with stunning rapidity. By February 1945, Allied air supremacy over Europe had become so complete that individual Allied fighters were hunting German aircraft like predators stalking wounded prey. The psychological impact on surviving Luftwaffe pilots was devastating, transforming once confident airmen into nervous, Desperate men who knew each mission might be their last. Lieutenant Erich Hartmann, the war's highest-scoring fighter ace with 352 confirmed victories, found himself leading increasingly futile missions against overwhelming Allied formations. His Jagdgeschwader 52, once the most feared fighter unit in the world, could now field fewer than 20 operational aircraft. Each sortie required careful calculation of fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and pilot fatigue resources. That could not be wasted on uncertain outcomes. "We are ghosts flying ghost aircraft," Hartmann confided to his mechanic while inspecting his battle-scarred Messerschmitt Bf 109. The fighter bore the scars of countless engagements. Its aluminum skin patched with salvaged metal from crashed aircraft. Like most German fighters still operational, it was a mechanical miracle held together by the skill of ground crews who worked miracles with virtually no spare parts. The Allied air forces, meanwhile, had perfected the art of systematic destruction. American and British bombers now flew in formations so large, they required separate air traffic control systems to prevent mid-air collisions. Fighter escorts accompanied every mission in overwhelming numbers, turning each German interception attempt into a potential massacre. Colonel Francis Cabreski, commanding the 56th Fighter Group of the United States Army Air Forces, observed the transformation with professional satisfaction. His Thunderbolt fighters now flew armed reconnaissance missions deep into German territory, seeking targets of opportunity with the confidence of predators in their own territory. "German fighters avoid us now," he reported to higher command. "When they do engage, it's usually a single aircraft making a desperate attack before fleeing. Organized resistance has essentially ceased." The statistics told the story with mathematical precision. In January 1945, Allied air forces flew more than 28,000 sorties over German-controlled territory while losing fewer than 100 aircraft. German opposition accounted for barely 20% of Allied losses, with the remainder attributed to anti-aircraft fire, weather, and mechanical failures. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was losing aircraft at a rate that exceeded production by more than 3-1. Hauptmann Walter Krapinski, a veteran pilot with 197 aerial victories, witnessed the systematic destruction of his squadron over the skies of eastern Germany. "The Americans come in waves," he reported after barely surviving an encounter with 50 Mustang fighters. "First the bombers, then the escorts, then the fighter bombers seeking targets on the ground. The sky belongs to them now. We are merely trespassers in our own airspace." The fuel shortage had become so critical that German pilots were ordered to avoid combat whenever possible, conserving precious aviation gasoline for defensive missions only. This created a vicious cycle of declining effectiveness, as inexperienced pilots received even less training while veteran airmen were grounded by fuel shortages. Squadron commanders faced impossible choices between training their replacements and defending German cities from Allied bombing. At the Rechlin Test Center, Germany's premier aviation research facility, engineers worked frantically to develop new tactics for the revolutionary Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter. The aircraft possessed performance capabilities that could theoretically match any Allied fighter, but chronic fuel shortages limited flight time to minutes rather than hours. More critically, the handful of operational jets lacked experienced pilots capable of exploiting their technological advantages. Major Georg Peter Etter, one of the few pilots qualified to fly the new jets, completed a combat mission lasting exactly 14 minutes, the maximum flight time possible with available fuel supplies. During those precious minutes, he engaged a formation of American bombers over Munich, destroying 2 flying fortresses before his fuel ran critically low. "I have the best fighter aircraft in the world," he reported upon landing, "but I can only fight for a quarter hour before returning to base. The Americans can stay airborne all day." The psychological toll on German aircrew had become as devastating as their material losses. Pilots who had once dominated European skies now approached each mission with the fatalistic acceptance of condemned men. March 1945 marked the beginning of the most intensive bombing campaign in military history, as Allied air forces launched Operation Clarion, a coordinated assault designed to paralyze all remaining German transportation and communication networks. With virtually no opposition from the Luftwaffe, Allied bombers and fighter bombers roamed German airspace at will, selecting targets with the methodical precision of demolition experts. The ancient city of Wurzburg burned for 3 days after. Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers dropped more than 1,000 tons of incendiaries on its medieval center. Similar scenes of destruction unfolded across Germany as Allied air commanders, no longer constrained by concern for German fighters, expanded their target lists to include smaller cities, transportation hubs, and industrial facilities previously considered too insignificant for major operations. General Major Galland, now commanding the remnants of the fighter force from a bunker near Berlin, watched intelligence reports documenting the systematic destruction of his homeland with the detached fascination of a pathologist examining a corpse. Allied bomber streams, some numbering more than 1,000 aircraft, crossed German territory unopposed. His entire remaining fighter strength could barely muster 200 operational aircraft on any given day, insufficient to challenge even a single major Allied formation. "We have become spectators to the destruction of Germany," Galland wrote. In his personal diary, the pages illuminated by the orange glow of burning cities visible through his bunker's periscope. "The Americans bomb by day, the British by night, and we can do nothing but count the explosions and estimate the casualties." The human cost of air supremacy had become staggering. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, and dozens of smaller cities lay in ruins, their populations scattered or buried beneath mountains of rubble. Allied air attacks were now killing more German civilians in a single week than German air defenses could shoot down Allied aircrew in a month. The strategic balance had shifted so dramatically that German anti-aircraft batteries represented a greater threat to Allied operations than the once mighty LUFTW AFFE. Flight Lieutenant James Edgar Johnny Johnson, Britain's highest-scoring fighter pilot, led his Canadian squadron on armed reconnaissance missions over northern Germany with the casual confidence of a hunter in a game preserve. "Jerry fighters are rarer than unicorns," he radioed to his wingman during a mission over Hamburg. "We spend more time looking for ground targets than worrying about aerial opposition." The psychological impact on German ground forces had become equally devastating. Wehrmacht units advancing toward the front lines were forced to move only at night, hiding in forests and buildings during daylight hours to avoid the constant threat of Allied fighter bombers. Supply convoys attempting to reach combat units were decimated by roving American Thunderbolts and British Typhoons, which attacked anything that moved on German roads with rockets, bombs, and machine guns. Oberst Hans Ulrich Rudel, Germany's most decorated ground attack pilot, attempted to provide close air support for retreating German armies with a handful of Junkers Ru-87 dive bombers. His missions had become exercises in futility, as Allied air superiority made sustained ground attack operations virtually impossible. "We can reach the front lines," Rudel reported to his superiors, "but we cannot survive there long enough to affect the battle." German industrial production, already crippled by raw material shortages and labor problems, collapsed entirely under the weight of continuous Allied bombing. Aircraft factories that had once produced hundreds of fighters monthly were reduced to smoking ruins. The few plants still operational were forced to disperse production into underground facilities and forest clearings, reducing efficiency to a fraction of peacetime levels. At the Messerschmitt factory complex near Augsburg, Chief Engineer Willy Messerschmitt surveyed the ruins of his life's work with the resignation of a man witnessing his own funeral. The facility that had produced the revolutionary Me-262 Jet fighter now resembled a moonscape of bomb craters and twisted metal. Production had ceased entirely after Allied bombers targeted the plant for the 7th time in 2 months. "They bomb us faster than we can rebuild," Messerschmitt observed to his assistant, stepping carefully around unexploded ordnance that littered the factory floor. "Even if we had unlimited resources and manpower, we cannot manufacture aircraft." In the middle of an ongoing bombing campaign. The final irony was that Germany still possessed some of the world's most advanced aviation technology, but lacked the industrial capacity, fuel supplies, and trained pilots necessary to employ it effectively. The few operational Me-262 jets achieved impressive individual success rates, but their impact on the war's outcome remained negligible. April 1945 witnessed the final agony of the German Air Force, as the few remaining operational units made desperate attempts to defend their homeland against the relentless Allied aerial armada. These last missions were characterized by a mixture of supreme courage and tragic futility, as German pilots flew obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds with the fatalistic determination of medieval knights charging machine gun nests. Oberstleutnant Johann Steinhoff, now commanding the elite Jagdverband 44, equipped with Messerschmitt Me-262 jets, led his small formation on what would prove to be one of the last organized Luftwaffe missions of the war. His unit possessed exactly 16 operational aircraft, the largest concentration of jets remaining in German service. Their target was a massive formation of American flying fortresses approaching Berlin, escorted by more than 100 Mustang fighters. The mathematics were impossibly against them, but Steinhoff's pilots represented the last of Germany's aviation elite. Major Georg Peter Etter, Hauptmann Franz Schall, and the other jet pilots possessed a combined total of more than 800 aerial victories, making them perhaps the most experienced fighter formation ever assembled. Their jets, when functioning properly, could outrun and outclimb any Allied aircraft in service. "Gentlemen," Steinhoff addressed his pilots before takeoff, "we know this is the end. But let us show them that German pilots still know how to fight." His words carried the weight of 4 years of aerial warfare, from the heady victories of 1940 to the present. Desperate defense of the homeland. The engagement lasted exactly 17 minutes. Steinhoff's jets, approaching the bomber formation at nearly 600 miles per hour, achieved complete surprise and destroyed 11 flying fortresses in their initial attack. However, the escorting Mustangs immediately swarmed the German jets, forcing them into turning combat where their speed advantage became meaningless. Of the 16 jets that had taken off from Brandenburg Airfield, only 7 returned, and 3 of those were too damaged to fly again. Major Heinz Bauer, leading a formation of conventional Focke-Wulf 190 fighters in support of Steinhoff's attack, found himself engaged by more than 30 Allied fighters simultaneously. His radio crackled with the desperate calls of his squadron mates as they were systematically shot down by vastly superior numbers. "They're everywhere," his wingman transmitted before his aircraft exploded in a ball of orange flame. "I count at least 50 bandits at 2 o'clock high." Bauer himself survived the encounter only by diving his fighter to treetop level and fleeing at maximum speed toward friendly territory. Behind him, the sky filled with parachutes as German pilots abandoned their burning aircraft. Of his 12 aircraft formation, only 3 reached base, and one of those crashed during landing approach due to battle damage. The human cost of these final missions was staggering relative to their results. Each German aircraft lost represented years of training and irreplaceable combat experience, while Allied losses were typically replaced within days by fresh aircraft and crew from training schools in Britain and America. The exchange rate had become so unfavorable that German commanders were ordered to avoid combat except in defense of critical targets. Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, the war's highest-scoring ace, flew his final mission on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. Approaching the formation of Soviet aircraft over Czechoslovakia, he achieved his 352nd and final victory by shooting down a Yak-9 fighter. Minutes later, he received word over his radio that all German forces had been ordered to cease hostilities immediately. "So it ends," Hartmann transmitted to his ground control, circling above the smoking ruins of a German airfield. Not with a great battle, but with a simple radio message telling us to stop fighting. He landed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 for the last time as a German pilot, the aircraft bearing the scars of 4 years of continuous combat. Statistical summary of German Air Force losses during the final months tells the story with mathematical precision. Between January and May 1945, the Luftwaffe lost more than 3,000 aircraft and pilots while destroying fewer than 600 Allied machines. The kill ratio, once heavily in favor of experienced German pilots, had reversed to approximately 10-1 against them. Those few German pilots who survived until the war's end possessed a unique perspective on the nature of aerial warfare and the mathematics of attrition. They had witnessed the transformation of air combat from individual duels between skilled pilots to mass industrial warfare, where numerical superiority invariably determined the outcome. The final surrender of German air power came not with dramatic aerial battles or heroic last stands, but with the quiet shutdown of engines on abandoned airfields across a defeated Reich. May 8, 1945, marked not only the end of the war in Europe, but also the conclusion of one of history's most complete military defeats. Destruction of an air force that had once terrorized half the world. In the underground bunker complex beneath Berlin, General Major Adolf Galland sat in darkness, listening to the silence where once the roar of aircraft engines had provided constant background noise. The communications equipment that had coordinated fighter operations across Europe now received only static, while wall maps showing the disposition of fighter units had become meaningless historical artifacts. The Luftwaffe existed now only in memory and in the scattered wreckage of aircraft littering German airfields. The human cost had been staggering beyond comprehension. Of the approximately 28,000 German pilots who had served in fighter units during the war, fewer than 3,000 survived to see the surrender. The rest lay buried in aircraft scattered across European battlefields, their skills and experience irretrievably lost to a nation that had gambled everything on military conquest. These men, many barely out of their teens, had paid the ultimate price for their leaders' hubris and strategic miscalculations. Allied air superiority had proven decisive not merely in tactical terms, but in its broader strategic implications. The inability to defend German airspace had left the Reich's industrial base completely vulnerable to systematic destruction. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble, transportation networks were paralyzed, and civilian morale had collapsed under the weight of continuous bombing. The Luftwaffe's failure had doomed Germany to defeat as surely as any lost ground battle. Colonel Charles "Chuck" Yeager, the American fighter pilot who would later break the sound barrier, flew one of the final combat missions over Germany on May 7, 1945. Leading his squadron of Mustang fighters on a reconnaissance patrol, he found empty airfields and abandoned aircraft scattered across the German countryside like the bones of prehistoric creatures. "It's over," he radioed to his flight leader. "There's nothing left to fight." The technological legacy of German aviation would outlive the Third Reich by decades. As Allied intelligence teams combed through the wreckage of German research facilities and interviewed captured engineers, the revolutionary jet engines, swept-wing designs, and guided missile systems developed by German scientists would form the foundation of post-war aviation development in both America and the Soviet Union. However, these technical achievements could not overcome the fundamental weaknesses that had doomed the Luftwaffe to defeat. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, The man ultimately responsible for the Luftwaffe's destruction spent his final days as a free man, rationalizing the defeat in grandiose terms that ignored the strategic blunders and resource mismanagement that had characterized his leadership. His addiction to morphine and disconnection from operational reality had contributed significantly to the Air Force's decline, yet he seemed incapable of acknowledging his role in the catastrophe. The surviving German pilots faced an uncertain future in a defeated nation occupied by former enemies. Many were imprisoned by the Soviets and would spend years in labor camps, while others found new lives in civilian aviation or engineering. A few, like Galland and Steinhoff, would eventually contribute to the reconstruction of German military aviation during the Cold War era. Lieutenant Erich Hartmann, after shooting down his final Soviet aircraft on the war's last day, landed at a German airfield and formally surrendered to approaching American forces. The world's highest-scoring fighter ace had survived more than 800 combat missions, achieving 352 confirmed victories while never losing a wingman to enemy action. His survival was itself remarkable, given the astronomical casualty rates among German fighter pilots during the war's final months. The lessons learned from the Luftwaffe's defeat would reshape military aviation doctrine for generations. The importance of pilot training, industrial capacity, fuel supplies, and technological innovation had been demonstrated with brutal clarity. No air force, regardless of individual pilot skill or aircraft performance, could survive the systematic destruction of its supporting infrastructure and training establishments. As the guns fell silent across Europe and the last German aircraft sat abandoned on grass airstrips, the age of air supremacy through industrial might had definitively arrived. The romantic era of individual aerial combat had given way to the mathematics of mass production and strategic resource allocation. The Germans had learned too late that wars are won not by the bravest pilots or the most advanced aircraft, but by the nation capable of producing the most planes, training the most aircrew, and sustaining operations for the longest period. The eagles had fallen, and the sky belonged to those who had never forgotten that war is ultimately about logistics, production, and the will to persevere through inevitable losses toward final victory.